President, the so-called Supercommittee created by the Budget Control Act has begun their work. Its mandate is to produce a plan by November the 23rd that will reduce future deficits by at least $1.5 trillion. As the chair of the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee, I've been invited to submit recommendations to the Supercommittee, and I will do so in the days ahead. Certainly, I wish this group well. However, Mr. President, it is critically important that we define success in terms that really matter to working Americans. Frankly, I'm deeply disturbed by the Washington groupthink that defines success narrowly in terms of maximizing deficit reduction. Well, I've come to the floor to urge members of the Supercommittee to embrace a broader and more powerful definition of success. Success must include boosting the economy and creating jobs. After all, the most effective way to reduce the deficit is to help 25 million unemployed and underemployed Americans to find jobs and become taxpayers once again. There can be no sustained deficit reduction without a recovery of the economy and a return to normal levels of employment. Indeed, just yesterday, the Congressional Budget Office released an analysis showing that if our economy were not in recession, if it were employing labor and capital at normal levels, the deficit would be reduced next year by an estimated $343 billion, a reduction of 1/3 of the deficit in 1 year, if we just had normal employment. So I have a simple but urgent message to the Supercommittee. Go big on jobs. That message would be strongly seconded by people like Connie Smith of Tama, Iowa. In January, she was laid off after working 27 years for the same telecom company. Since being laid off, she's been working as a contractor doing the same type of work for less pay and no benefits. Jean Witt would also agree. She was laid off in 2008 and is now a student at Iowa Western Community College, striving for a new career in nursing. She's hoping that good jobs will be available when she graduates. Mr. President, as I said, inside the Washington bubble here, our leaders have persuaded themselves that the number one issue confronting America is the budget deficit. But I assure you that ordinary Americans are focused on a far more urgent deficit, the jobs deficit. But I'm also concerned about a third deficit, the deficit of imagination and vision here in Washington today. I'm dismayed by our failure to confront the current economic crisis with the boldness that earlier generations of Americans summoned in times of national challenge. And let's be clear about the staggering scale of today's challenge. Our nation remains mired in the most severe period of joblessness since the Great Depression. As I said, some 25 million Americans are desperate to find full-time employment. According to new data from the Census Bureau, the poverty rate has risen to 15%, the highest level in 18 years. 20% of American children are being raised in poverty, 1 out of every 5 kids in America. Last week, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, Mr. Ben Bernanke, said that that unemployment is a, quote, national crisis. Well, very true, Mr. Bernanke, it is a national crisis. It's far and away the number one concern of the American people. And that's why an exclusive, single-minded obsession with slashing spending and reducing the deficit is not just misguided, it's counterproductive. If the Supercommittee cuts the deficit by $1.5 trillion and does nothing to create jobs, this would amount to a massive dose of anti-stimulus. It will further drain demand from the economy and destroy even more jobs. And that, in turn, will make the deficit worse, not better. It's the equivalent of applying leeches to a patient who needs a transfusion. Mr. President, we must stop this mindless march to austerity. Mindless march to austerity. Smart countries, when they have these kind of challenges, don't just turn a chainsaw on themselves. Instead of the current slash and burn approach, which is being sold through fear and fatalism, we need an approach that reflects the hopes and aspirations of the American people. To be sure, we must agree on necessary spending cuts and tax increases. But we must continue to invest in things that will spur economic growth, create jobs, strengthen the middle class, knowing that this is the only sustainable way to bring deficits under control. Again, I say to the Supercommittee, if you're serious about reducing the deficit, you must put job creation front and center in your deliberations and agenda, not just slashing and cutting government spending to reduce the deficit. Now, I don't want to be misunderstood. My preference, of course, is always to reduce the deficit. I know that. And as a senior member of the Appropriations Committee, I appreciate that we must seize every opportunity to prudently reduce federal spending. And there are opportunities, including in the Pentagon, to reduce federal spending while minimizing further damage to economy and jobs. However, I believe that we must be equally willing to say no to foolish, destructive budget cuts. Most importantly, as I've said, the Supercommittee must broaden its focus to include a sharp emphasis on creating jobs and boosting the economy. That's why I was very pleased by the plan presented by President Obama, the American Jobs Act. As the President said in his speech to Congress, the American Jobs Act boils down to two things: putting people back to work and more money in the pockets of working Americans. Most importantly, in my book, the American Jobs Act would dramatically ramp up investments in infrastructure in order to boost U.S. competitiveness and directly create millions of new jobs. Specifically, the American Jobs Act includes $30 billion to renovate some 35,000 schools and community colleges nationwide. This would create hundreds of thousands of new jobs, especially in the hard-hit construction industry. The legislation, the President's bill, provides $30 billion to help local school districts hire and retain teachers. This new fund would save or create nearly 400,000 education jobs. In addition, the American Jobs Act includes $50 billion for immediate investment in our transportation infrastructure. Again, this will dramatically boost employment and modernizing the arteries and veins of our commerce. Well, now, people say, how are you going to pay for all this? And these other investments, keeping our teachers in the classroom, renovating the infrastructure. How are we going to pay for all this to get our economy back on track? Well, for the answer, Mr. President, we again need to listen to the American people. I received a heartfelt message from Dan Carver, a fifth-grade teacher in Carlisle, Iowa. He says that he is struggling like other middle-class Americans to pay his bills and his taxes. And he doesn't understand why corporations and the very wealthy aren't also paying their fair share. In poll after poll after poll, by 2-to-1 margins, Americans want an approach that includes tax increases on those who can most afford it, those whose incomes have skyrocketed in recent years, even as middle-class incomes have fallen, those who have benefited the most from tax breaks initiated during the Bush administration. By a 2-to-1 margin. This should be a no-brainer for people elected to Congress. 2-to-1 margin. Read the polls. That's what people want done. You see all those people up on Wall Street? It's now spreading to Washington. There's even an event planned for Mason City, Iowa this weekend by a lot of young people saying, look, we have to raise revenue. We can't just slash and cut back and retreat. We need to raise revenue and charge forward. Mr. President, we'd be foolish to ignore the voices of working Americans from all walks of life. For more than a decade now, these good citizens have been told that tax breaks for the wealthy will result in millions of new jobs and a booming economy. That's what they've been told. They were told that wealthy Americans are so-called, quote, job creators. And if we just shove enough tax breaks their way, jobs will magically bloom. Frankly, this is the same old theory of trickle-down economics. And it manifestly has never worked. For ordinary Americans, the only thing that's trickled down are wage cuts, mass unemployment, upside-down mortgages, personal bankruptcies, and disappearing pensions. Instead of this failed trickle-down economics for the rich, it's time for percolate-up economics for middle-class Americans. We have a saying for this out in the Midwest. I've heard it many times. You don't fertilize a tree from the top down. You got to put it in at the roots. It's time to invest directly in jobs by renovating our crumbling infrastructure, rebuilding our schools, putting laid-off teachers back to work. And by all means, it's time to ask those who have benefited the most from our economy to pay more. Yes, to pay more to help finance these urgent investments. Because, Mr. President, these are the kind of things that individuals cannot do on their own. An individual cannot rebuild a highway or a school. An individual cannot retrofit a building. An individual cannot build new energy efficiency systems. But we can do this acting together. And that's why it's time to ask those who have benefited the most from our economy to pay some more. Mr. President, I close by reiterating that we need to pursue a path that first and foremost, right now, focuses on job creation. In the longer term, focus on deficit reduction. After we get the economy going and getting people back to work and being taxpayers again, then we can reduce the deficit, as the report showed this week. If we were to just have normal employment levels, we'd reduce the deficit by $343 billion. So I say again to the Supercommittee, don't just focus on slashing, cutting, and retreating. Focus on raising revenue and charging ahead. Investing in education, innovation, infrastructure. It means a level playing field with fair taxation, and a strong ladder of opportunity to give every American access to the middle class. It's time to put America back to work. It's time to change the tenor of the debate. It's time to get away from this groupthink here in Washington that if only we'll just cut more government spending, somehow magically people will go back to work. It's not going to happen only in your dreams. It will only happen if we are bold enough, as our forefathers and people before us were bold enough to raise the necessary revenues to put this country back to work. That should be the first charge of this Supercommittee. Mr. President, I yield the floor.